Hello everyone, welcome to Keening In. Now, very recently I managed to get my hands on the last few remaining Rolling Stones albums that I needed to complete my Rolling Stones studio album collection. So 23 albums in total, a very respectable figure for a group that's recently been considered nothing more than a blues cover band. I'm going to start at the bottom with my least favourite Rolling Stones album, and it's 23 out of 23, and it's from 1986. It's Dirty Work. I wouldn't say the Stones hit rock bottom with this album. I don't think they ever got to that point where they truly hit rock bottom, but I think they came within an arm's length of touching distance, I suppose. And I think most people agree that this is one of, if not the weakest Rolling Stones album. I think I'm kind of agreeing with the consensus on this one. And this album was really a difficult time for the Stones. They really did face the very realistic prospect of breaking up, and or at least being put on hiatus, or disbanded for a while or whatever. It was a tricky time. Mick and Keith were really not getting along with each other. Very bad creative differences. Also, as well, Mick was wanting to pursue a solo career, which, if it had proven to be, successful, which it was, he did a decent stab at it, but it wasn't anything great or anything. He kind of did have to come back with his tail between his legs. But if it did uh, prove to be successful, it might have spelled the end for the Stones. Who knows for sure what would have happened. But the thing is, I feel like at this point in time, Mick was having some sort of midlife crisis, perhaps. Maybe he thought that the Stones were holding him back to a certain degree, stopping him from doing what he was possible, he could possibly do, capable of doing. And he just wanted to, do something different. Maybe he just got a bit sick of being in the Stones, which is understandable. He'd been in the group for quite a while at this point. But even Charlie Watts was kind of getting sick of this guy. At this point, there's that infamous story of Charlie punching Mick, for what Mick said. So yeah, if you can upset Charlie, which he comes across as, he did come across, should I say, as a fairly easygoing guy. So yeah, it's not really a good sign, shall we say, for what Mick was kind of like at this point in time. And for Mick to be stuck in the Stones as well, when you think about, he came back from the Stones after his solo career kind of failed, I suppose, at least as far as he saw it, it failed. And he was stuck in the Stones. You can't really feel sorry for a rock star being stuck in one of the biggest bands in the history of popular music. I'd feel sorry for him if he got stuck in a minimum wage job. My heart would really go out for him. But being stuck in the Stones, not so much, in all honesty. So yeah, not a great album. It does have some decent things to it, though. I think there's two tracks on here that I think work really well. There's a track called Fight, which I think is really good, and there's a track called Had It With You, which again I really do like, as this almost demo like quality to it. This album generally has pretty damn poor production quality to it, but that track, it actually works quite well with it, and it actually benefits it to some degree. I think the anger of this album is, it has a negative and has a positive side. In terms of the positive side, Mick Jagger's vocal work I think is very good on this album. I think it's one of the highlights. He sounds different on this album than he does on any other Rolling Stones recording in general. And I think it's partly due to the anger that was going on at the time. You can kind of say what you want about Mick Jagger's attitude, but I think he really did try on this album. He really did, in terms of his vocal work, anyway, he tried. He did put the effort in, and you can't deny his commitment, I suppose, shall we say? And yeah, there's definitely something about his vocal work on this album. Now, the downside to that, to the anger that was going on, is I think the other members of the group don't really shine whatsoever. But it does signify a piece of history. It's not like it's just not a nothing album. That's kind of what I like about it as well. There is some decent stuff on it, and it does at least signpost an era of the Rolling Stones story. So it's not an album that I hate by any means. So for 23 studio albums over many years and many decades, for them to not release an album which I consider truly terrible, I think that's pretty good going. Again, for a group that's nothing more apparently than a blues cover band, I think that's very good. Actually, there is one thing I want to mention about Dirty Work before I move on, and as the album cover. It is considered by many to be the worst. I actually think it's not, it's not a good album cover. Don't get me wrong, but I don't actually think it's the worst. And it's kind of funny in a way that the studio, decided to put this, you know, red shrink wrap on it. There's a way to almost hide it. I don't know if the red shrink wrap's supposed to represent anger or whatever, but what other, studio album or album in general that has had this sort of coloured shrink wrap on it and a big hype sticker. It's very much like they were trying to hide the album cover. And I just kind of find that somewhat amusing. It's the only album I'm aware of where the label have tried to hide the artwork of the cover. That's what it feels like to me anyway. So we'll move on to Undercover. So 22 out of 23. And for a while, this actually was 23 out of 23. I know this album has its fans. I know Richard McCook's a bit of a fan of this album. I kind of, I've warmed to it a little bit. I think one track on here that I think is pretty good is Undercover of the Night, which I've heard before. It's on compilations and things, and I always think it's like Sympathy for the Devil of the 1980s. You can tell they put a lot of time and effort into it. It's got this very 80s production, but it's an 80s album, so what you expect. And I think it works pretty well. In fact, they probably put more effort into that one track than they did on the whole of Dirty Work, the whole album as a whole. But yeah, it's a pretty good track, and the other tracks on the album are pretty fine as well. It does the job, I suppose, and it's got much better production than Dirty Work. Way better. This actually sounds like a proper Rolling Stones album. Well, I think at this point in time they were just a bit lost, I suppose, creatively. And I think time had kind of caught up with the Rolling Stones. They managed to cling on to at least some degree of relevance. I think the Stones' true relevance had slipped away sometime in the mid 1970s, but they had at least some of it. They managed to cling on to an element of relevance, through the years, past that, mid 70s era. Well, I think at this point in time, I think it totally slipped away. The sort of inspiration that they had just wasn't there. I don't know if they were looking in the wrong places or whatever, because that's the thing with the Stones. They are leaders and innovators, but on the other hand, they are followers as well. And this album, it feels like the covering ground that they've already covered. If you're a completionist, you can kind of leave this towards the end, really, as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, we'll move on. We'll move up a level. And the next album I've gone for is this. This is A Bigger Bang. 2005, I believe this album came out. And that's the thing with the Rolling Stones. They sort of play with your brain a little bit when it comes to time. You think, oh, this isn't all that new, all old, sorry. So it's like a new album. But it's really not. It's got some age to it. It's over a decade old, but it just feels relatively new compared to so many of the albums because they are so damn old. Decades and decades old. But yeah, this is an album I was curious to check out. Just to hear what the Stones can kind of come up with. At this point in time in their career and their lives and everything. And this is an album that very much ticks boxes. It's a box ticking exercise, I suppose. It's an album that came out. So many Stones fans listened to it. Were interested in it, and some of them liked it. Some of them maybe didn't like it, and then everyone just moved on. It was like it's an album that's completely become, for such a big group as the Rolling Stones, it's become very obscure. There's one song on here that I think is actually very good. It's called Oh No Not You Again. Definitely check that track out, if you can. It's definitely a highlight for me personally of this whole album. But nothing on here is particularly all that bad. Nothing on here is particularly all that great. It's just perfectly fine, and it's like what you expect really from a bunch of kind of rich old guys at this point in time. So yeah, it does what you expect really. I think if you got high expectations, if you're expecting one of the best Stone albums of all time from this, I think you're kind of barking up the wrong tree. Really, don't really know what you're kind of smoking if you kind of thinking that. But it's not. I had fairly low expectations. I knew it wasn't going to be anything spectacular or anything, and I thought it was fine. So that's kind of all I've got to say about it. So we'll move on to this album, the most recent album by the Stones at this point, 2016's Blue and Lonesome. Now, this album is fairly unique in that it's the only album of the first 23 anyway. Who knows what's going to happen in the future. To be entirely, up to this point anyway, it's entirely made up of covers. And I think the Stones had, I wouldn't say like a midlife crisis at this point. I think they're a bit too old for that. I think Mick had that in the 80s, quite honestly. This is more like a three-quarter life crisis, I suppose you could call it. And maybe they wanted to, see if they could do what they did when they were younger guys, back in the 1960s, and record, an album very quickly, mostly based off of blues music, and see what they can do. And for the most part, they do a good job. Obviously, they know these songs very well. This is something I feel like the Stones could have done it really any time. I think this is a project they probably had in the back of their mind, in the back burner. But they recorded it quickly. They got it to market quickly, and yeah, it's a fine, you know. Stones, modern day Stones versions of these sort of standard blues tracks. And I've got nothing necessarily negative to say about the music at all. I think they do a pretty good job, all things considered. But it's nothing necessarily all that remarkable either. At the same time, it is what it is. But it's perfectly fine. The only real issue I have with this album is nothing to do with the music. It's everything to do with the cover. I remember when I first saw this album cover, this album design, and I thought it was just a work in progress or whatever. I was reading about it online on various websites and things, you know, a few months before it came out and that sort of thing. And I thought, yeah, I just didn't think anything of it. And then the album came out and I had this, and I couldn't really believe it. I was a bit flabbergasted, really. All the resources that the Stones have, hire the best artists, the best photographers, and even Charlie. Charlie was still alive, of course, at this point. He trained actually as a graphic designer, in his younger days. I think he could have designed a better album cover, in a coffee break, or whatever. And it's just like, why did we have to have this? If to just hold it back for another week, I know they wanted this to market quickly, but just hold it back for another week, and then design something better than this. The Rolling Stones tongue with a blue background. How long did that take to come up with? It's such a disappointment. I don't think would have been acceptable for a live album or a compilation album. The fact that it's a studio album is pretty unforgivable, from my opinion. So we'll move on, go up a level to Bridges to Babylon, 1997. This album came out. Not a great deal to say about this album. It is bland. It is a pretty bland Rolling Stones album. It's something that came out similar to a Bigger Bang. Some of the fans liked it, some of them didn't, and then it's just more or less completely forgotten about. It does have more quality to it than the Bigger Bang. It's another box ticking exercise by the Stones, and I think overall they do a pretty good job. There's some decent stuff on it, but not enough really to keep attention on it for too long. The next record we're going to be taking a look at, rather confusedly, is 18 out of 23, but it's also number 2 as well. It's the Rolling Stones number 2, which was released, as you can probably tell, straight after their first album, and it feels very much like a continuation of their first album. I think it is the most sort of disposable of all the Brian Jones era material, and it just doesn't really innovate all that much. It's a necessary step forward, but it's a necessary half step forward. It's a tighter album than the first album. It's got more, I guess, going for it in terms of the production and everything, and I guess they've learned a little bit more than they at this point in time, and they didn't know with the first album. But it's still early days, and they really hadn't formed a true sound of their own at this point. They were just relying mostly on cover songs. There is a track on here as well that's very, very good indeed. It's called Time Is On My Side, and I think it's one of the best Stones songs they ever recorded, particularly one of the best songs of their early days. But I think overall, it's just a bit disposable. It's a bit of a weak link of the Brian Jones era. It's progression, but not a lot of progression really. Yeah, definitely the best was yet to come from the Rolling Stones. So that's number two. Next, I've gone for their Satanic Majesty's Request. This is often considered the worst album Stones ever recorded, but I think this is too much of an interesting project really to be relegated to the very bottom. It's definitely the most quirky Rolling Stones album, and it's just a bit bizarre in places, and it kind of it doesn't really work a great deal, in all honesty. But it at least tries. That's the thing. It tries to do something, and there's some, outside of the experimentation. It's not like it's just weird and experimental, and it's nothing else. There is, She's a Rainbow on here. There is some good material as well. It's maybe just not enough, quite honestly. And this is, of course, a very ambitious album. It's one of the most ambitious albums the Stones ever did, particularly of their earlier days. It's the Stones trying to, do a Sergeant Pepper effectively, and that was not no small undertaking whatsoever. The problem is that, the Stones at this time were having a lot of problems with the law effectively. They were being followed by the police. They were being watched by the police. They kept getting arrested for drug charges and that kind of thing. They were, I guess, because they were standing against society to some degree. At least some people saw them as a stand against society at the time. They were being watched and that kind of thing. And they were spending a lot of time in court, and they were obviously getting distracted. And they actually spent a very brief moment in jail and that kind of thing. So yeah, they really needed their attention on the album and on the music and what they were doing in the studio, and they were being distracted. So to do an ambitious project when you're being distracted, it's not necessarily it's no real wonder really why this album wasn't as good as it kind of could have been. And I really do love the album cover as well. I think the album cover is fantastic. Take a look at the next album, which is on CD this time. It's Steel Wheels, Hold It the Right Way. Yeah, Steel Wheels from 1989, I believe this album came out. You have to excuse me, I haven't had this album very long. Yeah, so this is seen as a bit of a return to form, I guess, for the Stones. They had Undercover, which some people like, some people don't. I think it's fine, I suppose. But then there was Dirty Work, which is it's a low point. And then this came out, this followed Dirty Work, and this was the transitional period for the Stones to become, this big arena based, touring group. That's kind of their main focus really from this point on. The sort of, the albums, and recording and that came very secondary, I feel, to, going around the world and touring and everything. That was their main source of energy and the main source, because they make so much money out of it effectively. It really was a big cash cow for them. So yeah, this was the start of, the Steel Wheels tour was this huge thing, and they would tour the world, and they played in these big arenas in front of who knows how many people, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people. And yeah, this was the album that launched that transition really, and it's perfectly fine. I think it's a solid album. It's just a bit bland, I feel. I think it's a very long album. It's the start of the Stones sort of releasing all these long studio albums. You got this, you got Voodoo Lounge, you got Bridges to Babylon, a Bigger Bang. They're all kind of grouped together. These later, very big, long albums. It's got some, fairly unique sounding sections to it. But I think overall, it's just an album that really doesn't represent a particularly interesting era for the Rolling Stones. So move on to another CD era Stones album, Up Another Level, and it's Voodoo Lounge. A surprisingly good album. It's very, very consistent. It's like track after track after track, which is pretty good. I think they were definitely on a roll with this album. I think this is probably the most impressive piece of work since, you know, really something like Tattoo You almost, and I think definitely the high points of their more modern era, their later album sequence, I suppose. So yeah, definitely something well worth checking out. A good number of songs. You might surprise yourself if you've never really listened to this album or you haven't listened to it in a long time. It's a bit overlong and it does get a bit baggy towards the end. But I think the quality definitely shines on this album, so it's definitely worth checking out. I really do like the cover as well. I remember seeing the cover when I was a wee lad back in the day, and I always remembered it. And I was never quite sure what it was or what it was supposed to mean or anything. I still kind of don't know, in all honesty, but I think it's somewhat iconic. It's probably the most iconic Rolling Stones cover they came out with of their later era. So yeah, highly recommend Voodoo Lounge. So next up, I've gone for Emotional Rescue from 1980. This album, I believe, is made up of offcuts from Some Girls, the Some Girls album, recording sessions. And yeah, I do enjoy this album. It's strong, it's consistent. I like the atmosphere of this album. The production's fantastic as well. It's one of the best sounding Rolling Stones albums there is. Truly is fantastic. And yeah, I just like the feel of it. The album ends with a track called "All About You," which is almost, it's one of those tracks which blurs the lines between being awful and amazing. It's kind of, it's something that only Keith Richards could kind of get away with. It's almost like he's singing it drunk in a pub almost. One night, on Friday night or whatever. I just really like this album. It's got some really consistent tracks on it. There's nothing on it that's amazing or brilliant, but it never really it never reaches highs, but it never really reaches any lows either. It's one of those albums. Yeah, I highly recommend checking it out. I really do think it's a good Rolling Stones album. The only thing negative really about it is the cover. I think the cover's pretty garbage, really. I don't like the cover one little bit. It's pretty horrendous looking. It's almost like, anyone ever seen the film Predator? Starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. The heat-seeking eyes and everything. Yeah, it reminds me of that. Only I guess it was kind of impressive for the time, but now it just looks bloody awful. I don't know. I don't know if it was ever considered impressive, but the music's good, so that's the main thing. And it's out of our heads, the third Rolling Stones, UK album. And yeah, I think this is where the Stones start to sound like a rock band. They start ditching the blues cover band, the sort of feel that they had at this point in time, and they become more of a rock band. They're still covering quite a lot of material. This is mostly made up of covers, but the songs they cover are more rocky, typical Stones feel. And this is quite a happy album as well. It's one thing I can definitely say about it. Stones albums generally aren't considered happy all that much, but this is like a lightness to this album, and I really do appreciate that. It's definitely not a grumpy and mean Rolling Stones album. That's more uplifting, and despite the cover, which is quite, it's quite oppressive looking almost. But it's a great cover though. But the music itself is like I said, it brings a bit of a smile to my face overall. Generally speaking, this is Black and Blue, mid 70s album, and I think this is I was saying with the relevance slipping away at the point of Undercover. I think this is where it did sort of slip away quite. This is like the first album where it really began to sort of drift away. That the relevance of the Rolling Stones, and they kind of we're kind of clinging on to it really from this point onwards. But this is a decent, solid album. It really is. It's got not a great deal of tracks on it. It reminds me to a certain extent, in the sense that it doesn't have a lot of songs on it, to something like Station to Station by David Bowie, maybe with Bowie and Mick Jagger being buddies around this sort of time. Maybe Mick just copied their idea. I'm not too sure. But yeah, there's not a huge amount of tracks on here, and it's more longer, and it's quite a jammy album. Long jams on it. And I think it's perfectly fine. It's a good, solid album, and this is like the first album where they start to introduce a bit of reggae. You got Cherry O Baby on here. You got some stuff like there's a track on here which I particularly do like, Crazy Mama. I think is fantastic. Fall to Cries on here, an absolute classic Rolling Stones track, and it's fine. It's got some real good quality to it, and it's got some more, just middle of the road Stones tracks, and it's perfectly enjoyable. Good quality, good recording, production on it, and it does the job. It manages to be a perfectly decent, but at the same time unamazing sort of studio album by the Stones. And this is probably going to be one hell of a long video. I do apologise, but there's so many records. There's no way I could get through all this in 10 minutes unless I just don't say anything. But Tattoo You is the next album I've gone for. Recently been reissued, I believe, with all extras and everything like that. And yeah, it's a very good album. It's a bit of a mongrel album though. I've always felt, it's made up of bits and pieces from other time. It was sort of like an art, material they had on the back burner. Reserving the material, almost like squirrels squirreling away their nuts for the winter. And the only real issue I have with this album is the sequencing. I know some people like it, but I really don't. I don't like the sequencing of this album whatsoever. The idea was that we're going to have the rocking tracks on side one and the ballady tracks on side two, and that could have worked. And I guess I understand why people like that. I kind of do. I wish they'd have mixed it up a bit more and just had it better sequenced. I think it's a touch maybe overrated. I don't think it's as great as so many people claim. Or people say, "Oh, this is like the top three or whatever." It's not that good, but it's good, but it's not great in my opinion. And the cover as well. I've never been a particularly huge fan of the cover. I actually thought this was a lady for the longest period of time. I see that and I don't see Mick Jagger. I don't actually, not too sure, some sort of alien, I suppose. Alien, female alien from another galaxy, and then apparently it's Mick. It just doesn't look. If you look at Keith, you've got Keith on the other side. That looks like Keith. There's no getting away from it. But that does not. That does not look like a Mick. Right? I've actually seen the original photograph that they used for this, and I guess 1980s digital effects have masked him so much he doesn't even look recognizable to me anymore. But anyway, we'll move on to record number 10 we up to at this point. So we're getting into the top 10. This is where it really starts to heat up and get into the good stuff. And I've gone for the ever dependable first album, the first Rolling Stones record, Self-Titled. And yeah, I love this album. I'm back for this one. I really do like this album a lot. It's so rough and so sort of amateurish to a certain degree and thrown together. There's a track on here that it's called "Tell Me," and it's fantastic. I really do. Yeah, "Tell Me You're Coming Back" in brackets. A very very early Rolling Stones track. And if you hear this version of it, I believe there's two versions of it. But the version that appears as most common on and this sort of slightly later pressing is it's so amateurishly put together. You just can't help but love it. I really do. It's so different from you know Blue and Lonesome. You listen to this and you listen to Blue and Lonesome. They're kind of doing the same sort of stuff, and and that kind of thing. Blues covers and that sort of thing. But this has just so much more character to it. It just has so much more energy to it. Really does have this "Please Please Me" sort of feel. It's like the Beatles. But if anything, it makes "Please Please Me" looks well conceived and well constructed. It is a good album. Don't get me wrong, but that's the most amateurish Beatles album that was ever created, and it looks light years almost. Feels light years ahead of this album. It's so sort of thrown together. It's almost like it was something recorded in someone's garage. Well, that's one of the things I really love about it. I love the feel. I love the character of it. I love the amateurish nature, the ramshackle nature of it. And yeah, it's got some good stuff. I really do love that track "Tell Me" as well. So yeah, I put it in the top 10 just about. The next record we're going to be taking a look at is record number 9 in the charts, and it's this album. It's only rock and roll. A fairly, I wouldn't say average Rolling Stones album, but I'd say I'd definitely class this as in the good category. A pretty good Rolling Stones album. Everything on here is of good quality. There's nothing on here that's even remotely bad or anything. And it's a good listening experience, and it's perfectly fine. It kind of does kind of what you expect it to do of mid 1970s Stones release, but it's nothing anything remarkable or anything like that. And it does have on it, it's only rock and roll, of course, but I like it, which is a staple of the Rolling Stones kind of back catalogue. Overall, there's some good deep cuts. I think this is a pretty good deep cut album overall as well. I think that's one thing it's definitely going in its favour. Besides that one, title track, it's seldom heard a lot of the stuff on this album. So yeah, it's good for that reason. We'll move on now to this. This is album number 8 out of 23, and it's Some Girls, a real, I'd say a swan song for the Stones. I think this is the last truly great album that they released. This is like the one time where the Stones really surprised people and brought something out that really grabbed the spotlight and sort of dragged it towards themselves. And it's like you kind of, a lot of people maybe ruled out the Rolling Stones at this point. They brought out It's Only Rock and Roll, I've just shown, and Black and Blue, and that maybe people were getting a bit tired, and then this album came out and it's like reinvigorated them. And it's an album that came out during the punk era, and it's the Stones, I guess, to a certain degree, trying to be a bit more punky. It's definitely got a punkier edge to it. And I like the variations of tracks that this has. It's one of the most varied Stones albums there is, and it's you kind of not necessarily knowing what song's going to come next, which is quite rare for a Rolling Stones album. They generally have quite a narrow path that they follow. But this has got a bit of country on it. It's got a bit of it's got a bit of disco in it as well. It's a good varied album with a good nice gimmicky album cover that was controversial in its own way. They brought this out without getting permission and they got in trouble for it. So yeah, it's the Stones kind of being a bit of upstarts, a bit of for the first time in quite a while, and getting on the wrong side of people. And another thing as well with this album cover, Bring Your Up. I only just noticed this sort of somewhat recently, and maybe I noticed it and I forgot it in the past. But whatever. It's got George Harrison on it. I didn't know that. It's the second Stones album, I guess, with a Beatle on it. Their Satanic Majestys Request being the first one, and it's got George there. And I believe when this album got taken off the shelves, because of the stars that were on it weren't happy about it. George was the only one who didn't really care and just thought, just put me, didn't really give one, and kept his face remained. It wasn't censored out, which kind of says a lot about George Harrison. What a great guy he was. My face appears on a Rolling Stones album. Leave it, don't take it down. I don't want any money for it. That's kind of what a class act George was. But anyway, we'll move on from Some Girls, a great album, definitely an essential Rolling Stones album without any question or shadow of a doubt. To another, I'd say, essential Stones album. This is Aftermath, the first Stones album to have all their own material on it, and it's all pretty good material as well. There's some stuff on here which isn't the best of the best, but does have Mother's Little Helper. But it's one of my favourite Rolling Stones tracks. Mother's Little Helper. It's just it may be my favourite, in fact, Rolling Stones song that they ever recorded. Fantastic song, and I really do like this album. Where I think it just suffers from being a bit overlong, perhaps, and a little bit overstuffed, and that sort of thing. But it's very impressive, the fact that the Stones were releasing very little of their own material at this time, and then they came up with this huge, quite long album with all their own material on it, and it's all their own stuff as well. This really put the cat among the pigeons, I suppose, and really made the Stones what they were at this point in time. This is the album that made the Rolling Stones something special. So for that reason and that reason alone, it's worth putting this album as highly up as it is. It's Between the Buttons from 1967. This one just got one over aftermath by the smallest amount of margins, I suppose. I just prefer this one just a little bit more than that. I think this is more of a concise album. It's more of a neater, you know, well-formed album than Aftermath's a bit of a monster. You know, it's a really long album that they've squeezed onto an LP. This feels more like a proper, well, better thought out release, I suppose, overall. And yeah, it's all Stones material once again, I believe. You know, throughout, it's got the first appearance of Keith Richards doing a vocal track on the final song on this called "Something Happened to Me Yesterday," which I really love. I love that song. You know, when it gets to the end and Mick comes in and he starts talking about his producer, or is it Reg Thorpe or something like that? It always makes me laugh, and I've got no idea why, but it always does. It's such a comical end to the track. You know, it's supposed to be a bit goofy, I suppose. And I think this album has a very sort of Kinks feel to it as well, which I like. You know, I really love the Kinks, and I guess they had some inspiration, I suppose, from the Kinks at this time. You know, them both being from the same part of the world and everything. So yeah, I really do like this album. I think it's one of the best deep cuts albums. It's Goat's Head Soup. I'd say this is an album that comes within touching distance of being a great Rolling Stones album, but it's very, very good. It's a very strong album, very consistent. There's nothing on here that's weak, and you know, it's got Angie on here. It's got a track called is it Star Star Star, which is pretty X-rated, particularly by the early 70s standards. Silver Train's very good. Can You Hear the Music? It's almost like a 1960s throwback track, and yeah, it's very, very consistent. It's a very strong Stones album, just not quite up there amongst the very, very best. And you know, me talking before about Tattoo You know, the album cover on that with Mick doesn't really look like Mick. Again, with this, I always thought that was a lady. You know, Mick has this sort of very female quality to him, and I always thought that was a woman on the front cover. I honestly did. So yeah, when I found out it was Mick, I was a bit kind of disgusted, I suppose, is the word I want to use. But anyway, Sticky Fingers. You know, many people consider this the best Stones album. It is up there with the best. The only issue I have with this album musically is is the fact that I think it's too gentle. It's too much of a slow album. You know, this is considered one of the best rock and roll albums ever made. And you listen to it, and what do you get? You get a ton of ballads and slow tracks. You know, you just get, you know, listen to side two, for instance. You get Bitch on side two, which is okay, it's a rocking track, but then you've got I Got the Blues, which I really love. I love that track, that's fantastic. But it's a slow track, there's no getting away from that. Then Sister Morphine, and then Dead Flowers, and then Moonlight Mile. You know, these are so mellow tracks. You know, this is not a rocking album throughout, it really isn't. And even side one, you know, you got Brown Sugar, of course, which is a rocking one, but then you get Wild Horses and you know, and that kind of thing. It's very slow. It's kind of a very slow album overall. You know, the tempo is generally speaking quite a low tempo album, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's an album that's perceived as this big rocking album. It really, really isn't. I think it's a mellow album. It's a very mellow album overall, and it's a very good quality mellow album. But it's just not up there really with my favourites musically, and mainly for that reason, I think it just needs a bit more bite to it, quite honestly. Well, it's a classic album. You know, it's one of the best Stones albums there ever probably ever will be, and yeah, I really do like it. I think it's a great cover as well. Record number three is this Let It Bleed. I really do like this album a lot. Don't get me wrong. I don't think for a second I think this album's poor. The only issue I have with it, in all honesty, is side two, because side two of this album doesn't really do a great deal for me. You get Midnight Rambler, which is a good track. I really do like it, but I'm a bit tired of it, and I'm kind of just through with it, really. Then you've got a track called You Got the Silver, which I adore. I adore that track. But then you've got Monkey Man, which is fine. You know, it's whatever. And then you can't always get what you want, which I'm bored of. So really, it's only one track on side two that I have any real great degree of fondness towards. And for that reason, I've had to put it at number three. If it was things were different, if the sequencing was different or whatever, or it didn't have, you can't always get what you want, which I'm just through with that track. I just don't want to hear it anymore. If that was replaced by something else, maybe things would be a bit different. But it's got some really good stuff on it on side one. I think side one's much better. I think side one's fantastic. In fact, it's only Gimme Shelter that I'm a bit tired and don't really want to hear anymore. But Love in Vain, Country Honk, Live With Me, Let It Bleed, that's all fantastic. Side one, it makes the album, and side two kind of breaks the album for me a little bit. But number two, I've gone for Beggars Banquet. And I think this is the swan song for the Brian Jones era. I think it's probably, yeah, it is the best Brian Jones era album, and it came out at a time when he was kind of losing it. Really, he really was out of the equation. I believe he doesn't actually play a lot of the tracks that appear on this. You know, it's got Keith filling in for him, and he was just kind of losing his way very much. And then he comes in, you know, one day in the studio and he does No Expectations, you know, on slide guitar, and it's amazing. So it's one of those sort of situations really where it's like, you know, it's his last sort of gift for the group before, you know, before he had to depart, not only the group but the world, of course. So yeah, it's quite a touching album. I really do really have a lot of fondness towards it. I'm not a huge fan anymore because I've heard them too many times. But I still think they're great. Of Sympathy for the Devil and Street Fighting Man, kind of through with those tracks, but kind of everything else on the I kind of go along with fine. And I do think it's a highlight of the Rolling Stones as a whole, and it's a highlight of particularly the '60s Brian Jones era. And yeah, I think it's a great album. There's no two ways about it. It's an essential pickup. It's an essential album in general. Not if only you just want to pick up a Stones album. I think it should be an album that you know you seek out and add to your collection, whether you're a Stones fan or not. Really, you know, unless you hate them, of course. If you kind of like them, it's definitely well worth checking out. So we'll move on before I ramble myself to death. So the final studio album that I'm going to be focusing on, and we've finally got there at the end after what feels like hours and hours and hours, mainly because it has kind of been almost. And it's Exile on Main Street. This is for me my favourite Rolling Stones album. You know, and I'm a big Brian Jones fan. Brian Jones was dead, you know, dead and gone by the time this album came out. So yeah, it just goes to show how great the band were, even without Brian Jones in it, that they were able to come up with this. This is a spectacular album. This is one of the best double albums ever made. It's in the top 10 as far as I'm concerned, maybe even top 5. It's one of my favourite albums ever made. And yeah, I think it's the only Rolling Stones album that I really do feel like it's one of my favourites, you know, ever. I think the other ones I really like, but they don't quite make it into my personal favourite albums ever, you know, just in general. But this one does. This one's truly amazing. It really, and the weird thing is, the first few times I listened to it, I kind of was a bit underwhelmed. I wouldn't say I disliked it or anything, but I was just like not too sure about it. But the more I listened to it, you know, you got it. This is an album you definitely have to listen to several times. I think that's why it kind of got overlooked when it first came out to a certain degree. Anyway, you need to keep listening to it. You need to give it time because it is a double album. You know, it takes a while to do that, but sooner or later you'll kind of come around to it. And when I kind of did, I was like, why the hell didn't I like this album this much the first time I heard it? You know, and it just juices you really over time. And I just think it's fantastic throughout. Really, side one in particular, you know, you got Rocks Off and then Rip This Joint, Shake Your Hips, Casino Boogie, Tumbling Dice. You know, that's supremely good quality, and that's just one side of you know this album. You know, there's three more to go. So yeah, really good stuff. I think the only issue I have with this album is a minor issue is the sequencing is on side four. You got Shine a Light, and I'd have swapped Shine a Light with Soul Survivor. I'd have finished. It's this very gospel track at the end. I think it would have faded out and been much better than Soul Survivor. But overall, this is an impeccably perfect album, you know, double album. And I think it's the Stones' high point. I don't think they ever did anything quite as great as that. I really do feel like the likes of Sticky Fingers and Beggars Banquet and Let It Bleed were kind of building up to this point, and this was the peak. And then it kind of all fell apart, unfortunately, with not to some great degree, but they never really quite reached the heights again with the likes of Goat's Head Soup, and then they didn't really get any real greatness again until Some Girls, and that was kind of it, really. So that's it for this video. This mammoth video. I'm really gonna look forward to editing this together. So yeah, we'll wrap this video up. And if you like this video, if you managed to watch it all, you deserve a medal. I think I deserve several medals for making it, quite honestly, and several £1,000,000. But it's a little bit of discussion that I wanted to kind of get done. And so thanks guys for watching. If you want to add your favorite Rolling Stones album, in the comment section, or if you think I'm wrong on something, or you want to, you know, just add a comment of any sort, you're welcome to do so, of course, as always. So thanks for watching, and goodbye.